Okay, so hopefully my presentation follows on quite nicely from Floor's presentation. And I'm talking about grassroots innovation and becoming more business-like. So in terms of that triangle presented, this is really the pull on non-profit sector organisations towards the market sector. Hopefully, beyond transition studies, this has some interest in terms of the sharing economy, because the case study comes from the sharing economy, and it talks this idea of hybridisation of the grassroots and for-profit sectors, and also talks a little bit about the challenges of democratising the governance of sharing economy platforms. So, yeah, I'll just provide a bit of background and details on the research approach, and then run through some interim results from an empirical case study. So just to look first really at my definition of grassroots innovation, or well, not mine, it comes from Seyfang and Smith, and that is networks of activists and organisations generating bottom-up solutions for sustainable development, solutions that respond to the local situation and the interests and values of communities involved. So it's worth noting that this comes from a shift in transition studies, which occurred, I guess, around 8 years ago, to open up looking at civil society as a space in which innovation emerges, as well as technological innovation and emerging within the market. So the kind of things that have been studied in terms of innovation are things like community energy projects, community currencies, but there's been, to date, as far as I know, less research around grassroots innovation within the sharing economy. The sharing economy in the sense of this world of peer-to-peer platforms. So in the early stages of my research, one thing I noted in the grassroots innovation literature is this sharp distinction between grassroots innovations and market-based innovations, and really the literature talking about there being very different actors with different objectives and different practices. Part of the objective of my project was to also look in the non-profit sector literature to see what connections could be made with the emerging field of grassroots innovation. And so one thing I picked up quite quickly from that literature was this idea that non-profit sector organisations have a tendency to become more business-like. So this is a quote from a paper by Meyer et al., and they did a survey of around 600 papers within the literature on this topic, and came to this statement saying that the becoming more business-like of non-profit organisations is a well-established global phenomenon that has received ever-growing attention from management and organisation studies. So that seemed like a contrast to me in terms of the perspective within transitions and the perspective within non-profit sector literature. So, drawing on that kind of piece of initial insight, I came to two research questions. The first being, how do organisations engaged in grassroots innovation change over time, in particular to become more business-like? And what might be the implications of these organisational dynamics for socio-technical niche theory? I probably won't get too much chance within this presentation to talk about the niche theory aspect of it, because I've tried to keep the presentation for a quite general audience. But if you're interested, please do have a chat with me afterwards. So moving on now to the case study, which looks like you can't really see. So the case study looked at Freegal, which is a network in the UK. It's a spin-off from FreeCycle. It's separated from FreeCycle around 5 years ago, basically an example of this grassroots micropolitics that was mentioned earlier, for various reasons and various conflicts within the organisation. In terms of how Freegal works, it's very simple. It's an online message board which people can post offers of items that they want to give away for free and requests for items that they would like to pick up from other members of their community for free. And it's also very geographically based in that there's often membership restrictions and you can only join groups within a specific area. So that's how the groups work. The network itself consists of around 400 groups in the UK, run by approximately 1,000 volunteers. It's rather tricky to know how many. The organisation, well, the network claim that there's 1.5 million members of these groups. This is obviously a vast overstatement, as many members are not inactive, but it gives a sense of the scale of interest that's really, that people, 1.5 million people have gone to the effort of signing up to at least look in the groups and then potentially engage with them more or less after that. And it's a very interesting organisation in that it has a democratic governance system, so there's democratic and discursive processes in terms of voting and discussion around the direction for the platform and the organisation. And this all takes place online as well, so all basically using closed message boards. I won't talk too much about the research methods, but just to say that in exploring the case, I've constructed a longitudinal case study of how this organisation has developed over time. And that was done retrospectively, thanks to a wealth of online information presented by the organisation Friedel itself. Also a series of interviews, surveys, and actual participant observations within these digital spaces. And it brought up a whole host of tricky ethical issues and interesting dilemmas as well. So, on some results, which I'm just going to really talk about a series of trends in which the organisation became in different ways more business-like over time, and then come to talk about some of the pressures externally that were exerted on that. So the first one being goals displacement. So I'll just run through a series of quotes from statements at the annual general meetings for over a few years and see the change in terms of the goals. So the first statement talks about there being tens of millions of people in the UK who've never freegulled, and an ambition to change that. So really engaging with the concept of system change and that kind of ambition. So that was in 2011, around 2 years after the organisation had been founded. 1 year later, the goals have shifted considerably towards a more business-like goal of generating income, and this is justified really in terms of having a sustainable future. It's only about maintenance now, and highlighting the risks of significant or terminal decline within the next 18 months to 2 years. And 1 year later on, that kind of trend is continued further, that the goals are talking about very much internally orientated and maintaining the organisation and securing successes to date. So you can see that desire to engage with wider communities and to promote more reuse through the groups has diminished in terms of the practicalities of running the organisation. So this was also accompanied with a growing bureaucracy within the organisation. And so this graph here, over time, shows over the period of 5 years the number of policies and formal procedures that the organisation has developed, and that grew, I guess, for around 3 years and then plateaued, and more recently started growing again when the organisation had a fundamental shift in its structure to be able to change to a form of profit-generating co-op and move away from being a voluntary association. In the non-profit sector, such growth in bureaucracy is closely related to reducing per-member participation in the organisation and a centralisation of the power and within the network. So this second graph really speaks to that. What it shows, which again, apologies if it's difficult to read, it's a graph of over time how many messages per month the members are posting within the message boards, not that are used for exchanging goods, but are just used for discussing and running the organisation and exchanging knowledge and engaging in learning processes. So you see a decline from around 8,000 messages at the start of the organisation down to around 1,000 messages now. This decline is even steeper than it appears because at the outset there were only about 100 people involved, whereas now there's around 1,000 people involved. So per member activity in the organisation has really declined very steeply over time. Likewise, this graph shows the number of, as another example of the centralisation of the network and the organisation in terms of decision making. This shows how many members of the organisation, of activists and volunteers, are engaging in voting on various issues that the organisation faces, and determining the direction of the platform. So from around nearly 250 at the outset of the organisation in the initial polls where they tried to establish their objectives as a grassroots network, down to around 100 more recently. And again, that's gone in parallel with a great deal more decision-making autonomy for the elected leadership of the organisation. And likewise, there's been a significant degree of professionalisation within the organisation. So at the outset, there's a very strong ethos of it being a voluntary-only organisation. And particularly, there's been professionalisation of the functions within the organisation around ICT development and external engagement. So I won't say too much more about those. But just to move on to some of the external pressures which have been driving these trends for the organisation to become more formal and businesslike. So we see evidence of processes and requirements and expectations of external actors driving some of these this trend. So, for example, the Frigel were very keen to engage with a range of different innovation funders within the UK to win funding, to be able to further develop the platform, but also to engage in promoting use more broadly. This proved hugely challenging for the organisation due to the expectation of these innovation funders that they'd just be dealing with for-profit organisations who were seeking to establish a sustainable business model. So in this case was interesting, I guess, because Frigel already had a significant scale when it was founded, because it took the groups with it from FreeCycle. Also, in the work that Frigel have done to engage with government actors, particularly trying to influence and shape reuse policy to try and promote the space for community-based actors to be engaged with that, these actors essentially expected a full-time professional person to engage with, which is obviously hugely difficult for people who are engaging in such a voluntary activity within their spare time. So those, in my thinking at the moment, those are really, I'm conceptualising those as a form of, at least in the case of the innovation funds, a form of niche resistance. So here the niche actors are resisting the values and practices of the grassroots organisations. So also other pressures from commercial competitors. In particular, lots of different companies have tried to copy the platform and commercialise it, non-successfully as of yet. I guess maybe due to the contrast between the ethos of giving things for free and the effort to commercialise it. But that has exerted the pressure on Frigel itself and brought concerns about the degree to which their usability of their platform really can compete with those commercial competitors. Also, concerns were really expressed about the pace of digital innovation more generally, and I guess the example used was that one of the technical leads within the organisation was concerned about how the user experienced the platform compared to, say, using Facebook, so that people's expectations are continually rising as digital innovation progresses at a pace within wider society. And so this was a kind of pressure from the ICT regime. So just really to draw to the end of the presentation, in terms of saying out a few future directions for work within this area, I think I didn't really get the opportunity to look at the trade-offs being made within the organisation and what was gained and lost in terms of becoming more business-like. And I think one of the big things that the non-profit literature says anyway is that by becoming more business-like, you hugely increase your chances of organisational survival and participation within the sharing economy niche. But I was personally ambivalent about this in that there was a diminishing level of engagement and the nature of the platform was reflecting the ambitions and desires of an ever smaller group of people. Again, there's a question around the desirability of niche protection for such grassroots organisations and whether it is desirable or practical to offer any protection from pressures to become more business-like. I think that's quite a tricky question. And then also, I think, talking about the pressures towards the end of the presentation, it raised questions for me really around the dynamics and structures of mixed market grassroots niches, such as the sharing economy can potentially be conceptualised, and a question about the suitability of those niche theoretical frameworks really for explaining the process in those cases. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that point with my acknowledgements just to my funders and the many colleagues within my department there who supported the research.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Questions or comments? You first, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you for an interesting case, but I'm a bit triggered by your starting point, maybe even a bit critical, that you say, okay, I want to look into a business-like development of such platforms, and then you have selected a case where it may have happened or has happened.
Yep.
And when I look around, then I see a much larger diversity, also within energy niche. They see that to go more a business tour, more to go a community tour. And I would be more interested if it could be framed in professionalization, and there are different strategies to go that way, and that this could be one possible solution. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that I would like to mention about your case, that you're saying something that seems a bit what happens at the overall level, that you see that they have a different, it's like a multinational, so in the main office they have other kinds of discussions and do other kinds of, develop new kinds of strategy. What is happening at the base can be very different, and we saw that, for instance, in the Netherlands in repair cafes, that how they organize repair cafes locally is very different from how the thinking develops at the main office. And they might professionalize further and even become commercial, but they won't do that at the community level automatically. And could you comment on that, and could you relate that to your case, please?
Yeah, can I ask you a quick question? But what's your disciplinary? Are you coming from innovation studies perspective?
Yeah.
Okay. So to answer the second part of the question, that was clearly the case that there's a difference in the practices of the centralised, increasingly centralised leadership and the community members. What that tends to be associated with in the non-profit literature is this diminishing participation and hence a diminishing internal legitimacy of the organisation, which is to some extent being traded off for external legitimacy. So I think we have to be careful when coming from an innovation studies perspective to not totally frame everything from that perspective, if that makes sense. I think there are other things that are important within these organisations apart from their contribution or perceived contribution to scaling and transitions. I don't know if that answers the second part. Could you remind me of the first?
It was on the that's actually a matter of professionalization, and that one of the strategies can be more business-like, and that would be more interesting to have a larger sample and investigate different kinds of strategies that are applied.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be interesting to do. It wasn't possible within the scope of the project that I was doing. I still think there's real value in the case itself as it's opening up this specific strategy and also building on the non-profit literature, which does identify this as a major trend in non-profit organisations. And I think that's, for me anyway, helpful to make that connection between the two, rather than totally framing grassroots innovation from our innovation studies perspective.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering, in terms of the kind of business-like shift, whether there was discussions among the groups and maybe even interviews that you did. Yeah. Do they frame it in that language? Do they feel like this is happening? And is there a backlash against that, or what are their kind of attitudes towards it?
Yeah, so the organisation itself has been in a constant state of flux, was in a constant state of flux about this for 4 years. So it took 4 years to go through all the discussions and engaging with the resistance from some people. It was a highly political process that took a really extended period of time before they got to the point about a year ago where they had a vote where the majority of people voted to shift to formally generating revenue. But also there was an aspect that I feel like I maybe portrayed it as too deliberative, that people drop out, and as the organisation becomes more bureaucratic and more like a work organisation, then people's motivation for engaging also really diminishes over time, to the point where they either leave or just engage very much with the local area.
Yeah, you quoted, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You started by quoting Saifang and Smith, and I was wondering whether you have also looked into Adrian Smith's work on translation between niches and regimes, which I think could be very interesting for you, where he kind of argues that when you have these radical niches or grassroots niches or whatever you call them, and they engage with the regime, that it's kind of the art of maintaining their radical core on the one hand, while at the same time really also translating and adapting to the regime while maintaining their radical core. And a lot of the networks that we study struggle with this dilemma, and often when I ask them, do you have questions to us, they ask this, how can we scale, how can we become more business-like without losing our core? I'm like, well, you just said it, by doing it both.
Yeah.
By protecting the core. And for them, that often is like an eye-opener, that you don't have to choose between becoming more business-like, but that you can try to, as long as you maintain your radical core. So maybe it's an interesting dialectic perspective for you, the translation concept.
Thanks for the reference. I hadn't picked that up, so I should look into that. It does sound like an interesting area to explore.
Okay, maybe one question from myself. You sort of use specific indicators to measure how these communities or these organizations become more business-like, so centralization, bureaucracy, professionalization. But in a way, you could also see them as indicators for institutionalization rather than businessification, however you want to call it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, maybe it's just an inevitable dynamic when scaling up. You know, when these initiatives become quite large, there is some need for organization, I guess.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that they become more business-like. So maybe you can reflect a bit on the choice of your indicators for in your study.
Yeah, so the indicators come again from the non-profit literature and are quite well established. I guess again that's highlighting this tension between the two perspectives, that what as an innovation studies scholar you would see as necessary and helpful institutionalisation, that the scholars of Grassroots would see as eroding the core essence and values of the organisation and the practices. So, yeah, I think that's is a tricky thing to engage with, and maybe one of the challenges of working at that kind of interdisciplinary interface between the two fields.
I guess it relates back to Flora's question as well. I think there's sort of the core element is still that they are not going for profit. And I think in the case that you described, that you do not measure whether or not they're becoming more profit-oriented. I think that would really take away the core of their ambitions. So that could be sort of an additional indicator perhaps to add to your research.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they have become more profit-orientated and adopted a new structure to enable profit generation, not through that service that was offered there, but through developing different services to generate profit to cross-subsidise the community aspect of the work. Thank you.
Okay, we have to stop here. Thanks a lot, Chris.